I'm J.R. Jameson. Today on The Facing Project, I'll sit down with Canadian environmental journalist Trina Moyles to discuss her memoir Black Bear, a story of siblinghood and survival, and we'll explore the fragility of our relationships with human and non-human species alike, and the imperative to protect the wild. After years of working for human rights organizations, Trina returned to northern Alberta for a job as a fire tower lookout, while her brother Brendan worked in the oil sands, a place vulnerable to a boom and bust economy and substance addiction. When she was assigned to a tower in a wildlife corridor, bears were alarmingly visible and plentiful, wandering meters away on the other side of an electrified fence. Over 4 summers, Trina begins to move beyond fear and observe the extraordinary essence of the maligned black bear, a keystone species who is a subject to the environmental consequences of the oil economy as humans. At the same time, she searches for common ground with her brother Brendan and his struggles with addiction on the land that bonded them. Stay with us. I'm J.R. Jameson, and you're listening to The Facing Project. My guest today is Canadian environmental journalist and author Trina Moyles, whose new memoir, Black Bear, A Story of Siblinghood and Survival, explores the fragility of our relationships with human and non-human species alike and the imperative to protect the wild along with the people we hold closest. Trina Moyles, author of Black Bear, A Story of Siblinghood and Survival. Thank you so much for joining me on The Facing Project.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on the show.
Black Bear, as you write, is a story of growing up in bear country in northern Alberta during one of the province's greatest oil booms, and how you, an environmental journalist, and your brother, who worked in oil and gas, would inevitably learn to draw boundaries and brace yourselves for different forms of loss and the way you lived your lives as you lost track of each other and the primal pull to love without question. You go on to write, this book is a story of reorientation, of fear and survival, of bears and oil, and of finding our way back to family and the wilderness that inspired us. I also found it to be a book about empathy and understanding, and also about navigating complex grief. You pull the reader into the interconnectedness that's humanity and nature right from the jump. Take me back to the early moments of drafting this book and the decision to unfold the interconnectedness of these stories of nature and family into the broader story of finding a connection back to not only the land and your brother, but also how to navigate grief and the loss of both in the physical realm.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a beautiful question. And you make it sound like it was very easy, and it was not. Oh my goodness, this book was written over 7 years. So it took a very long time to weave some of those themes that you mentioned together and to even understand what it was that I was working on, which now I'm learning, like this was my 3rd book, and I'm starting to realize that's a very normal process for a writer as they set out on a thing. Sometimes we have a very clear idea of what we want to write about, and then you wind up, the story takes like sort of a life of its own and becomes something else. But for me, the story it truly started with the bears. People say, why did you want to write about bears? And I was like, well, at the time in 2019, when I started working on it, it was my 4th season as a wildfire lookout in northern Alberta. And I was stationed at a different tower, and it was a tower with a very particular reputation. There was quite a few bears that lived in the area, and everybody kind of knew this in the forest. I always say in the forest, meaning like firefighters and other lookouts. This tower had a reputation for being a bear tower, we called it. So I was like a little bit nervous to take over this station, not really having had, even though I'd been like the daughter of a wildlife biologist who studied bears, I didn't really have my own stories of like having to share space so closely with bears and have to sort of respond to those situations on my own, being out in the bush alone. And so certainly that summer there was this like very confident adult female bear with 2 yearling cubs who lived very close to the tower, was very comfortable with the proximity, even though I had, my one dog at the time. And she would not budge from the tower site. Like she had made her home there previously with the previous lookout, and she did not want to go. So I found myself in that first summer, I just felt like I had to write about the bear. It was so, I'm not sure how many people have had close bear encounters, but they really, you feel it in your whole body. Like, your hairs stand on end, your heart rate increases. You're probably giving off a certain hormone to the bear even. And, I'm quite confident bears can pick up on fear. They can probably smell what it is that our bodies emit. And after these close encounters with the bear, I just felt like I wanted to make a muse of it. I wanted to write about bears. And I knew I wanted to write a book about bears. I just didn't know what shape that would take. And so over the process of working on the book, the book, sometimes they say, actually began as like poems. I was working on my master's at the University of British Columbia at the time and thinking about this thesis I wanted to write, but really I was taking like short fiction classes, I was taking poetry, and I just started writing about the bear and these close encounters and my frustrations with the bear of like everything I'd been taught about like trying to scare bears away, and bears shouldn't be afraid of people. We often hear like a bear that isn't afraid of people is a bear that we should be quite afraid of. And I was. And so the bear started to surface in poetry, in short stories. And I knew I wanted the focus of bear to become a book. But I wasn't sure, like I knew I didn't want to write a natural history book. I didn't want it to be just about bears, because I think so much about the story of bear is also the story of people and the way that over millennia people have related to this creature, that could potentially kill us, and sometimes does, though it's extremely rare that happens. I think that underlying fear is such a part of the way that we relate to the species and fear the species and create so many different stories from it. And over the course of the 7 years that I worked on it, I did integrate my own personal stories into various drafts. And sadly, in the spring of 2022, I lost my older brother. My brother and I had quite a complicated relationship through, not through childhood, we were very close. And then through adolescence and into early adulthood, we became estranged. We had both been exposed to substance abuse and addiction in our adolescence, growing up in the North in a small town, in an oil town, as you had said. And that was sort of a byproduct of substance abuse, and addiction is often a byproduct of resource extraction in small communities. And looking back as an adult, as I was working on the book, I sort of explore some of those themes. But it became very apparent when I lost my brother, when he passed, that just like I had felt this really strong impulse to write about bears, I felt like I wanted to write about my brother. I wanted to try and understand that relationship and the way it was fraught and some of the mistakes I had made or the way I had stereotyped him. And so those two storylines began to weave together, I think at first not so effectively, but then over time and with the help of some close editor friends, I think I was able to bring those together more seamlessly. And like you said, it occurred to me at a certain point, the book is not really about bears. It's actually more about empathy building and trying to, heal the ways that we are divided from one another, whether that's like between, our close human relationships or between, relationships with another species. So I don't think this is a book. I'd originally wanted to write something a lot faster. And then as this project unfolded, I realized the time is what made, I think, the narrative work. And but it was something I learned through the process of working on it. It wasn't an intention I had from the get-go.
Sometimes stories come to us when they're ready to be told, right? And I think you did, as I mentioned, a beautiful job of weaving in empathy and understanding through the lens of watching the black bears and also understanding your brother and his trials and tribulations and what he had gone through. I find titling stories as a writer to be really hard. Because especially when you write a book, what do you name the thing? Like the permanent thing that when people see the title, they think, oh, I want to pick this book up and turn it over and learn more about it. So I'm curious to know, why Black Bear? What does that come to symbolize to you as the broader story?
Yeah, again, it wasn't the title that I had from earlier drafts, but the black bear, as I worked on this story, I realized the symbol of the black bear was something I wanted to unpack because in North America, we have three species of bears, right? We've got the black bear, the grizzly bear or the brown bear, and the polar bear. And then there are some subspecies within those, but I won't get into that. But it was interesting to me because the black bear is such a, biologists will say like the black bear is a successful species in that it is so abundant really across North America. And it's spreading into, it's found even in Mexico. Like the black bear is one species of bear that has been able to figure out how to live closely with people and more or less make that work. They're also a species of bear that reproduce faster than brown bears, grizzly bears, and polar bears. Like every year and a half, a black bear mother can reproduce, whereas it takes longer for a grizzly bear. So they're sort of, this is sort of an ugly term, but they're seen a little bit like the rats of the bear species, and often, as I realize, like we also think of the black bear often as a pest because it does tend to live quite closely to communities. So the symbol of the black bear as the pest, as the abundant species of bear that we can sort of afford to make more mistakes with, meaning more black bears get put down versus brown bears, grizzly bears, or polar bears. And then also like the symbol meant to me, like thinking of almost like the idea of the black sheep, I thought of the black bear. Like, with my brother, I felt like, especially through his adulthood, he'd struggled and that had created quite a bit of family strain. And I think he always carried sort of this sense of shame for those decisions, especially, as he got clean and, was working through his addiction. I think he always carried a lot of shame for some of the choices he'd made, even though that's so many people struggle with these things, right? But I sort of thought of as my brother as the black bear or the black sheep of the family. And, and again, it's like these strained, fraught relationships. Sometimes we just want them at arm's length. We don't want to deal with them because they're too complicated, or they're too much of an inconvenience. That's another thing. This idea of the black bear as an inconvenience to society or an inconvenience to the individual. And I think I did frame my brother in that way at a certain point as like, you're just too complicated. I can't deal with this, pushing him away. So I love that question because I think the symbol of the black bear is very loaded. And I love, someone who's written about bears, I do love bear literature. And, there are quite a few books that are titled just very simply Bear. And I think that's because it's like, when you have these encounters with bear, you think of literally nothing else because you're just watching the bear and you're like, what is the bear going to do? How is the bear going to react? And I sort of love, like, it's both, that's nerve-wracking, but there's something really beautiful about that too, where like everything else falls away and it's just you and the animal.
You and the animal.
So,
I love that. And I learned so much about bears, but particularly black bears through your book. And understanding your brother through your words, it's also the titles like Black Bear and your brother, it's also like misunderstood, right? In so many ways. But you do take the reader on a deep dive into learning about black bears, which I appreciated because I didn't realize all the pieces you write on about them, about how they are kind of the rat of the bear world and how they're dispensable in so many ways. And you also demystify their existence through your writing, and you teach us not to be afraid. You write, all too often we want wildlife on our own fixed human terms, safely observable through zoo enclosures or from a jeep on a safari or a comedic reel on social media. We desire the raw, exhilarating feeling that proximity to wild creatures offers, but in reality, we don't always want them as neighbors. We don't want to be inconvenienced or threatened by them. I found myself longing for protection of those glass enclosures that keep people and bears separate. We're living in extremely challenging and divisive times in both Canada and the US. And maybe I'm reading a bit too much into this, but is there a metaphor here on life in general?
I think so. And I can't say I set out with that intention to write about about those big themes and those things, those divisive issues that we're dealing with right now. But it's interesting you ask that. I had a very good, close writer friend ask me after one of the events I did over the last month, and he said, the book is really about dominance. He's like, this is a book about dominant culture and the way that we exert ourselves over another group of people or another species out of fear, out of this feeling of entitlement or righteousness, and sometimes we're not even aware that we're treating one another in this way. I think the book really, although it is so focused on these individual relationships with both my brother and then the particular community of bears around the tower, I think it does apply as a symbol for the times that we're living in right now. Sort of our gut reaction to thing, which sometimes can be, quite ugly or we feel these sort of dominant or colonial things rising up in ourselves, We so want, it's such a human, one of the lines in the book is like, what is it about being human and the need to be in the right, or that sense of legitimacy, it legitimizes ourselves, to treat one another this way. And I think it's a symbol for these times that we're living in and how challenging and how messy that is. Yeah, I think that's
And it's also, right, the stories we tell ourselves based on our own lived experiences and maybe what we've learned about the other, whether that's a person or wildlife, but our own set of experiences set us up for what we think about, as you write in the book, the other is a term that you use. And I want to get back to some of these current challenges, and this does connect a bit to that, but I want to focus on the misunderstanding of the black bear itself. We're taught in Western culture kind of two things about bears in general. I was reflecting on this as I was reading your book. What are the things I've learned about bears? And it's one, that they're soft and cuddly stuffed animals or caricatures in children's books, right? And two, that out in the wild, they're to be feared or conquered. And I think about lodges, especially out west, and, stuffed bears, grizzlies, right, that have been killed, and also black bears. But the idea of a bad bear is solely a human construct. And as you write, bears are mostly afraid of people. And when pushed out by wildfires, bears follow their nose to food sources, often created by humans. And in this new territory, they face their greatest risk: humans. The number one cause of death among black bears is indeed humans. Talk more about these stories we tell ourselves and the reality of what is.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a I'm glad you pulled that section or that sort of thought from the book. It's thinking about myself going into that fire tower experience, how little I actually knew about bears, even though we are a culture so obsessed with bears. I think we really don't know their true nature. There's very few people that do. And those that do are probably the people that do have these closer relationships with them on a day-to-day basis. Because I would say bears, we love bear attack stories, for example. Those continue to be the stories that sort of dominate in the media headlines when we do talk about bears, even though those events happen so rarely, so rarely. And yet that's what we know when we go into encounters with them. So no kidding, our hackles are up when we immediately meet them. But I think what we don't talk about with bears is bears practice great restraint all of the time because they have to. This is a survival thing, right? If they're going to as humans are encroaching into their habitat inevitably, bears have to practice enormous restraint in what even if they're scenting us or scenting all the things we put on the landscape, they have to make those decisions whether or not they're going to wander close. And I would say for the most part, most bears figure out how to avoid us, how to use the landscape when we're not around, or they do grow quite tolerant in our presence and they're able to be on the landscape with us. But those attack stories happen so rarely. So it's such an unfair thing to put onto a bear to an extent. One bear expert who I've gotten to know, Phil Timpany, who lives up in northern British Columbia, and he runs a commercial bear viewing operation. He says, it's interesting because there's so many different human sets of behaviors that a bear has to read. Far more sets of human behaviors that a bear has to figure out what is this person going to do versus how many sets of behaviors a bear actually has. Maybe 5 to 6 that a bear will show you and communicate with you. Whereas there's far more that that are sort of thrown at bears by humans. But yeah, they're incredibly restrained for the most part because they have to be, and the bears that aren't are those tend to be the bears that that get put down or that we call the problem bears, even though we've literally created the problem. Yeah, we've created the problem exactly, and we very rarely think of them as like good bears. So that's sort of what started to shift for me at the tower, where I recognized actually these bears that have grown quite comfortable being around me, meaning that they weren't getting into my garbage was securely contained, my scents were quite low, my impact on the land was as minimal as I could make it, really, knowing I didn't want any negative interactions with them. Well, then we could, those bears and I learned how to share space, and I realized because bears are they know where they want to be on the landscape, just like us. They have their favorite, spots to go graze on dandelions, just like we have our favorite restaurants or grocery stores. They know where they are and they also have, they have particular relationships with other bears. And so by tolerating those bears quite close, in a way, they were good bears because we had learned to read one another's behaviors. And I think that's the problem with, we have this instinct when we see a bear just to chase that bear away. Well, I mean, when you do that, you never have the opportunity to see what that bear looks like when they're relaxed, and just my other friend who's a bear guide, she often says, she's like, bears are allowed to be curious, just like people are curious. And, the presence of a bear doesn't signify aggression. A bear, showing curious behavior, that's allowed. But our impulse as people is to, chase bears away. And that's really the dominant message that we've been taught. I have learned I would much rather be around a relaxed bear than a bear that is very wary or afraid of people, because there you might get more unpredictable behavior. And I think that's true for our relationships with people too, right? We can't navigate space with one another when emotion is so charged or reactivity is so charged. Yeah.
There's a beautiful moment in the book where you're reflecting on mutual respect and not mutual avoidance, which is what is often taught, right, between humans and black bears, and finding ways to coexist without causing problems for the other. One way is moving bears from Western culture it status to personifying them. Robin Wall Kimmerer wrote in Braiding Sweetgrass that if a bear is an it, we pull the trigger. We can bulldoze down habitat. But if the bear is a her, we may think twice. Talk more about this.
I love this moment in the book, and I read often from it because and I remember it too, those summers that my thinking of the bears was starting to shift. The way I was seeing the bear was starting to shift. And it moved from this sort of this way that we tend to objectify the other or nature or wildlife, and it shows up in our language exactly like that beautiful quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer, the way that we, she says, English robs a language in a way. And, we talk about things like it as if, humans have more are superior to wildlife, which would just be an it. And I remembered even being on the phone with friends and I'd see a bear outside and I'd say, oh, I've got to go. Someone is outside. And my friends know I'm alone at the fire tower, right? Just with my dogs. And they're like, someone? Don't you mean something? And then it occurred to me, I was like, wow, even the way I am talking about the bears is shifting. And I think there was great power to name that both in real time and then also on the page when I was writing the book. There was that section of the book really does mark this shift in moving from a way of objectifying something to really starting to build a relationship, with the bears. And I really drew a lot from Robin Wall Kimmerer's writing and thoughts around that. I'm not sure that I had really, that had occurred to me before. But then when I was out there in that experience of relationship building with the bears, it really did. Yeah, the idea of language can be such a colonial thing, and we can use language to weaponize a thing and create distance from, between ourselves and whatever it is that we're describing. But that really that marks the point in the story where it starts to shift, and that distance starts to lessen. Yeah.
And even as a reader, I started to wonder when you would mention you had spotted a bear, I started to think, is it Osa? Right?
Yeah. Oh.
Based on the way you described the bears, right? Like half moon shapes I think it was Osa had the half moon shapes on her body. And there was another bear that had a circle, right? And so I started to personify them as well, right? Because anytime you mentioned a certain bear, I'd be like, oh, I hope it's Osa. I hope Osa has come back, right? So it does shift this perspective in a really empathetic kind of way. And talking about language, you even mentioned, and I don't have this right in front of me, so I may get this wrong a bit, so correct me on this, but the word carnivore, right, is connected to bear in the English sense, but really bear in other languages, primarily indigenous languages, is grass, right? Or yeah, talk more about that.
Yeah, that was beautiful. And that was from the Indigenous Climate Action, had this beautiful seminar on bear and different indigenous groups sort of knowledge and perspective around bear. And the word for black bear in the Cree language is Masqua, and it means from the grass. And the knowledge keeper who shared that with me, Jeff, offered this story of like black bears being born from grass. And I thought, like First Nations cultures, their knowledge is so important of like human wildlife relationships because they really are built on observation. And the more time I spent watching bears, I realized like they're hunters as well. But for the most part, their diet is vegetation, and like my dad would sometimes joke, like they're a fierce predator of dandelions. Yeah, and that's primarily what I watched them eat in the close proximity around my tower, or they'd climb the trees and feast on like the early sticky poplar buds. That was like one of the first things that they ate when they came out of the den, which was really cool. So yeah, I loved that. I think like when we can turn to other cultures to understand the way that they understand, not just bears, but other species. And it's often built into language, these really deep observational things about, I think, an animal's true nature. And I loved that idea of the black bear being born from the grass. That's how I always saw them. Sometimes they'd be entirely immersed in the grass and you'd only see like the grass, like waving, and I'm like, oh, I think there's a bear in there. And then you'd see a little, like some black ears pop up, or, the little hump of the shoulder. But yeah, there's so much we can draw, I think, from First Nations culture, and not just bears, but human wildlife coexistence in general. Not to romanticize it, but I mean real things built in, that the way certain communities have lived with animals, and not from this sort of like Western colonial stance of like keeping people and wildlife separate. I think Jeff talks about like this idea of the respect of distance. And I loved that because I was like, oh yes, if you watch bears interacting with one another, there's always this little buffer. Unless when they mate, which, is so rare in a bear's like realm, for the most part, they keep this like very particular buffer of space between them. And I think that's very true for people too. Like we need to keep these distances with bears. It's respect for the bear, There is this very human desire, I think, to want to be very close to bears sometimes, especially the more time you spend with bears. But bears themselves don't operate that way with one another. Like they need that respect. And so, yeah, there's so much we can learn from First Nations cultures.
Do you see parallels between understanding the instinctual life of black bears and the cycles of balancing empathy and understanding with addiction or grief?
That's a good question. That's a big question, a big bodied emotional question. I think... I feel like I drew so much from watching the bears, and I, through time, started to like something I just respected so much about bears is that like this idea that a bear knows where they need to be on the landscape. Sometimes I'm so like, I don't want to say I'm jealous of that as a human, but I sometimes wish I had the confidence and certainty that a bear has in where they are and what it is that they're supposed to be doing, whether that's like grazing or like this immediacy of like preparing to burrow under the earth for, depending on where they are, for like, 5, 6, 7, 8 months of the year. Like a bear has to make really instinctual and sort of hard choices, but they seem to do it with such, like, honestly, with such ease and grace. They do have to make difficult decisions as well. And I think, like, in Osa, as you mentioned before, is such a big part of the book because she was the bear that I had, I watched the closest, and I really, felt that space between us shrinking. And it was in my last season at the Fire Tower that I had watched her become a mother, and that was like such an amazing feeling for me. And then I had watched her raise the cub, and it was so cool to see like insights into her parenting style. And like she really wanted the cub like quite close to her, whereas I watched other mother bears like, be more comfortable with like a greater space from their cub. So she and her cub were quite close. It's pretty like typical for a young black bear for her first litter just to have one cub. Maybe she had had 2 and lost one. But anyway, she raised him over the 18 months. So I watched them over the 2 years together. And I knew in the spring of 2022 when I'd lost my own brother, and I'd been out at the Fire Tower processing, being faced with the enormity of that grief. And I watched Osa with her cub, and I knew every time I watched them, I just felt like I was like, oh, it's going to be the last time I see them together because she's going to have to wean the cub. And I was sort of dreading it, because I was so sad and I was so attached to the bears, and I was so attached with this idea of mother and cub. I really didn't want to see them split up. And even though I knew it was inevitable, it was coming. And I saw her kind of like toughening him up, and like playing quite roughly with him, like wrestling. And then I also saw him exhibiting some dominance back to her too. And that was sort of interesting. I was like, oh, wow, like, look, he's learning. He's like, maybe he's ready to be on his own. But he wasn't, of course. And then I did witness like the act of her chasing the cub up the tree over and over and over again. And you could visibly see the cub's distress. That was really distressing. I thought I would be, and at the same time, I was processing my own brother's, I was processing the grief of losing my brother. And I found watching the bears was incredibly meditative. And there was something about this, like, I thought it would be so horrible to watch that process of the weaning. And I was quite shocked that I even got to see that. I didn't think I'd actually just see it. I thought one day I'd see Osa and she wouldn't have the cub, but that wasn't the case. But there was this like power in what she was doing too, and this confidence. And it's like she was doing that out of love and necessity. And as I was working through like so many emotions with my brother as well, and trying to accept that he was gone, the loss of him. I think I did take something from watching the bears so closely, and the ways that we move forward. I could have chosen other coping mechanisms in dealing with the loss of my brother. I had struggled with addiction myself too. I could have fallen back on that. I could have not gotten out of bed, and I didn't that summer. I continued to get out of bed. I climbed the ladder. I sat with my grief. I felt the discomfort of it. Yeah, and in watching the bears, I drew a lot of confidence from them, and a lot of, in processing this loss of attachment, watching Osa do it and do it with this grace and this, like, to me, I was like, it's a necessary act of love. And that's how I felt with my brother too. It was like letting all the memories and the emotions of him run through me, but then also letting go too, and recognizing I would have to move forward. So yeah, I don't know. I learned a lot from those bears for sure.
I want to keep on the topic of your brother. You approach his struggles with addiction first with shock, and then building barriers between the two of you, and then with great tenderness. In doing so, you share how you also struggled at first with squaring how he could have been so brave during childhood when he had an encounter with an elk, or when he rode a 6-meter wave in Hawaii, and how he'd also been a star hockey player and popular at school, and also your ally and protector, but also an addict. You write, I didn't know you could grieve someone who hadn't died. All those years I'd mourned the loss of my older brother, my protector. I'd failed to understand how he needed protection too. As the story unfolds, you begin to empathize with your brother and the loss of the young man he'd been, the loss of his hockey identity and lifelong dream, and having to find a new way forward in life. How did you balance this honesty with protection, both of him and of yourself?
That's a beautiful question and observation. And so much of this is I think the gift of being a writer is that you get to work through these ideas that you had, both like in the present as you're writing and then thinking back on how you previously had viewed a thing on the page. And I feel like people ask me, they're like, did you find that healing? And I think I did. I mean, and without, at the risk of that sounding like, I don't think writing is inevitably therapy. Therapy is therapy.
Mhm.
But I was also able to look at the story of my brother and realized how I'd gotten that wrong. But that had also come from a place of such innocence, like it had just been the two of us. My brother was 3 years older than me. He
Mhm.
was my protector growing up. And I think sometimes we have this idea, and in that I had this idea of my brother as always being the brave one, always being a few steps ahead, always being there
Mhm.
for me, which he was. And then through early adulthood, and I understand so little about the science of addiction and what was going on through his brain, the need to use, and then also the pressures. Like, I don't think anyone really thinks about when you're young, you're not thinking about the way violence is normalized. You're not thinking about those things. I didn't know what it meant to grow up in an oil boom town. And now looking back as an adult, I was like, oh, well, of course we were. I mean, this is what, social scientists are finding about resource extractive communities as well, or communities that are on the front lines of those experiences. There's higher incidence of substance abuse and addiction. There's higher rates of domestic violence and misogyny. And there really was this, I think, when I think about what it would have been to be a boy in a community where we grew up, really this idea of like, I don't want to use the word toxic masculinity because I think I don't know if that's a positive thing, a positive label to use, but really this pressure to be maybe I'll use the expression alpha, like to be very tough and to be very brute and to
Mhm.
be, excel at athletics, which my brother did. Even in the way that, you would talk, like, again, that theme of dominance, having dominance over this like quest for superiority. I think my brother struggled with all those things. And then he was very physically small. He was always one of the smallest boys in his class growing up. Though he was a very talented hockey player, he was very, very small. And that prevented him sort of from moving forward in a professional way, which had always been his dream. So I think my brother experienced, a lot of pressure, even though I always saw him as sort of, the sibling who had it all figured out and who was, ahead of me and would always know what to do in any situation. He was obviously also struggling for
Mhm.
answers and for support and for protection as well. And seeing him as a young man, moving from our small community, this is such a common rural experience, to go from the small community into a larger center and to feel totally disoriented and lost. And he found a community working as a bartender, and there was a very high rate of substance abuse. And a loss of many things that, those supports he'd had in our own community. So I can see how he fell into addiction in his 20s, struggled with it, and really struggled with the shame of it.
Mhm.
As he and I became estranged, and his relationship with my parents was so fraught, and he saw himself falling behind, what
Mhm.
other young men in our community were doing.
Mm.
And then he began working in the oil and gas industry, which also comes with a set of pressures on men and women working in isolated conditions in camps, in putting an immense amount of strain on relationships with significant others and with families,
Mhm.
higher rates again of addiction. So there were great pressures on my brother, and in working on the story in the book, I realized, yeah, how he really truly had needed protection as a little boy, and then also as a man.
Mhm.
Um, um, yeah, I really felt enormous empathy for him. And I wish I had practiced more of that,
Mhm.
in real time. That is, there is a sadness there that I carry in that, but I, I wanted to write about it because I feel like so many people can relate to that.
Mhm.
Um, and it's these, it's often our relationships, people that we familial relationships that are the most fraught, the most loaded, and there's such a tendency just to want to push it away and be like, this is too problematic. Like I can't deal with you, you know?
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and I carry regret there for sure.
The two of you are starting to rebuild your relationship, and you're starting to see the complexities of his life and navigation of life. There's also this underlying culture of oil and gas and the COVID-19 pandemic that happens at the same time. There's a scene where your brother is wearing a sweatshirt with the I love Canadian oil and gas slogan, which was one that had come to represent a rise in populism and the people versus the elite during the pandemic. There's sort of a juxtaposition, right, to jobs that are harmful to the environment, but also create livelihoods. And also the belief that liberals are threatening to take it away with their policies and values, like this us versus them mentality. And this is similar in the US, right? The rise of populism here. And it does feel like, at least here in the US, there are divisions that are too vast to bridge. But something shifted in you that I think is kind of a main crux of the story. You started to lean into your differences. And you write, when I saw beyond the one dimensional lens of my brother as an oil worker, as someone with political beliefs I didn't agree with, I realized it's possible to love someone without agreeing with them or even fully understanding them. My brother and I might never really know one another, but we practice love and empathy for the other. We could learn to lean into the paradox of that which polarized us. Talk more about this, and what do contraction points teach us if we embrace them rather than run from them?
Yeah, that's such a beautiful question. Or observation. I feel I felt like I had so misunderstood my brother, and because we seemed, especially on paper, so divided in pretty much every respect, really. Like sometimes I'd be like, how did we come from the same parents? I don't understand that. And I think
Mhm.
that's a very relatable thing that, adult siblings are navigating, or the question that they're asking themselves. But I really started to lean into like the ways my brother was showing up for me, even though our politics were so different. For example, he came to so many of my writing events.
Mm.
And it surprised me. Sometimes I'd look up and I'd see him in the audience and I was like, wow, he came. And I'd be talking about hard things. Like my first book really explored like resource extraction in Central America and that the impacts on communities. And I remembered this whole conversation was being facilitated in one of the Q&As on, what are the parallels between, mining extraction in, say, Guatemala to northern Alberta with oil and gas. And here's my brother, an oil and gas worker, sitting in the audience and,
Mm.
listening, taking in this dialogue. Like that was so meaningful to me that he'd showed up for me and he knew my politics were different, but he was there because of love. He wasn't there because of
Mm.
my politics. He was there because I was his sister. And I think I realized like that, and it was very similar with the bear story too. When we're on the defense, we're never going to build a relationship. And so,
Mhm.
and then another example too that I talk about in the book was during COVID, our family had a small gathering, sort of somewhat nervously, like many families did throughout the pandemic. And a good friend of mine had joined me for dinner, and I'd sort of warned him. I said, like it could get tense because I have such different politics from my brother. And he was sort of like, that just sounds totally normal. And like any family would deal with that. And I was like, oh, you're right. And then the conversation was absolutely not political. It was just like a wonderful evening together.
Mm.
And I realized that I'd been bringing so much of this defensive energy into my relationship with my brother, and it was really preventing me from building trust. And
Mhm.
then once my brother and I, there were moments where or for example, looking at the climate crisis, here's my brother working in oil and gas. There had been a fire that had threatened one of the sites he was working on. And he called me up and I was out at the fire tower and he was like, wow, like this is a crazy fire season, acknowledgement that the climate crisis is having real impacts on people and communities and was impacting him personally. And, he called me to thank me. He was like, oh, I'm so glad for what you and your colleagues do, because one of the other lookouts had spotted that fire. As it was threatening the area where he was working. So there were ways that we were starting to reconcile our differences and I think to see one another. And even as I was working on this book, I reached out to my brother's colleagues who still work in oil and gas to ask more questions. What is it like? And that in itself, I started to learn more about, the social impacts on people who work in these industries and the hard choices that they have to make. And they're not the enemy, and these industries are never going to improve, in the best way possible for environment and for people who work within them if there's all this defensive energy coming towards them. So it's, I think I had to check my own pride and ego and not to say, there are some fundamental things my brother and I would likely have never have agreed on. And I sometimes do wonder if he was alive today, what our relationship would look like, because things have become even more divisive. So I'm not trying to romanticize it. But I did recognize some fundamental things that in coming at my brother with such defensive energy and some righteousness on my part, I was really preventing that relationship from growing, from trust, from deepening, and really getting anywhere productive in working together and trying to find common ground. So I know it's just such an individual story, but I think it reflects on a larger societal level right now.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think of, my own experiences and relationships I have with people in my own family. And I think that's true across the US and Canada, right? Where we don't all think the same. And so we all have someone in our family who might have different ideological beliefs or political beliefs. And part of navigating our relationships in life is trying to understand the other. And I do want to talk a bit about grief some more, and also some of these closing statements you had at the end of the book that's connected to what we were just talking about. When your brother did take his own life, your mom said that by trying to make sense of it, that his brain was broken. But what you recognized was broken was a colonial system that bred boys to deny their feelings and prove themselves and their societal worth through money and systems that isolated workers. You write, and I'm paraphrasing a bit here, oil workers were just as dispensable as the wildlife, the black bears. They cleared out the forest, and men in trades are exceptionally more likely to die by suicide. I do not know how to turn a blind eye to these graven environmental injustices, nor do I know how to stay silent about the mental health crisis faced by the oil and gas industry's labor force, who are at higher risk of substance abuse and addiction. I don't know how to ignore the connections between the industry and substance abuse and my brother's decision to take his own life. One does not inherently lead to the other, but there's no question that the stress of my brother's work and his ongoing struggles with addiction made him vulnerable. It's been 4 years since your brother died, and I'm assuming about a year since the book was finished before it moved into production on the publishing side. Where are you now on your answers to these thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm just starting to dig back into, that is one part of the book that I have read from, because I think it does frame sort of this understanding that I came with to my brother and realizing all of these risk patterns that he fit into. And I think losing someone to suicide is such a complicated grief. You have so many questions, so many unanswered questions, that will never be answered. We'll never know all of the things that motivated him. But now in having done more research, I see that he was vulnerable. He was vulnerable, and his story, unfortunately, is not an anomaly. It fits within this much larger story that is happening and not just in oil and gas, but in many resource extractive communities, especially where they're remote and rural, and there's a great deal of isolation. I'm realizing he is a part of this much larger story that is so little talked about. And I'm kind of digging into it, and working on a feature article and reaching out to, the very few. There's not a lot of research about the impacts of working in these trades and the mental health effects. But one social scientist I spoke to just a few weeks ago said to me, it's an open secret. That's what she said. Suicide amongst workers is an open secret. And that very many workers today know someone personally or know of someone they've lost. Companies, it's not regulated. Some companies refer to it as sudden death on paper versus suicide. It's really a big issue. And it's, I asked the social scientist, I said, why is this not more talked about? Why is the research not more funded? Why are we not looking at more answers? And she actually, one thought that she had was, it really is a cultural thing. And I'll speak to Alberta, this idea of, you mentioned populism, this idea of, some people will call it petro-citizenship. And people are very afraid of, because we are in this very reactionary, divisive time, instead of looking at, okay, what are ways that we can structurally improve, shifts for workers, the length of time that they're away from their loved ones, sort of the taboo nature of even accessing some of the counseling supports that are available to workers. Like, instead of structurally changing things, there's really this fear of like, well, there's nothing wrong with the industry. The industry has to go on and productivity is the bottom line, right? And she mentioned too, she's like, there's a lot of parallels with that with environmental concerns as well. So there's this defensiveness to make improvements because of this reactionary time that we're in. I'm not sure if that's making sense, but this is something I've been thinking a lot about lately. But as 4 years since we've lost my brother, I finally feel at the point, I think I sensed when he passed, at some point I would probably start doing deeper research and becoming more of a mental health advocate. And I think my brother would want me to do that. He was someone who wore his heart on his sleeve. He spoke openly about his struggles with addiction. He reached out to friends who he knew were struggling. And in this way, I have had people ask me, like, what do you think your brother would think of the book? And he wouldn't have agreed with everything. Of course, he wouldn't have agreed with all of my take on the industry. And his experience would have been far more nuanced, right, of the ways that care showed up in the industry that he worked in and the ways that people informally support one another. But I also, in this way, feel like in telling the story, it's not necessarily to like shut down oil and gas. It's if we're going to have these resource-based economies, how do we care for environment? How do we care for people who work within them? And how do we care for those communities who are on the front lines of them? And so, it's still a journey that's unfolding for me, but I'm realizing there's something very real there that has been swept under the rug, as another mental health crisis worker told me. It's a very real thing that's impacting these workers. And it's an interesting time in Canada anyways, with this like quest for mega development projects and this urgency, the sense of urgency to go fast for the sake of the economy. And I'm really, I think even just my family's personal story is, it's that we need to protect these workers. Like, we need to protect these communities on the front lines of it all. And there are social costs to all of it, and there are environmental costs too.
If someone is listening to our conversation and they're struggling with reconnection to a family member due to a political or ideological differences, or perhaps even addiction, what advice would you give to them?
I feel like sometimes just being in the same room as my brother helped. Visiting him in his home helped me build empathy, because I could see him in other roles outside of the roles I kind of always pigeonholed him in. And that was like watching him be a father. That was something I felt very grateful for, that I had the opportunity to see him become a dad, and the way that he was with his children, which was very tender and loving and gentle. And it made me drop some of the fear, because I saw how he was capable of those things, and he wanted me to be a part of that. So I think and I think sometimes too, we're so on the defense with one another, we're not always cognizant of the ways that people are communicating with us and trying for connection. So for some simple things, like my brother he never texted, and everyone is so obsessed with text messaging. And he was someone who always would call, he'd always call. And sometimes I'd be hesitant to pick up because I was like, do I have the headspace and the energy for this right now? And I wish I would have picked up more often, because that was my brother's way of reaching out, and at times I met him halfway in the middle there, and sometimes I didn't. And that was okay too, because it is important to protect our own energies. But I think, again, sometimes we're so defensive, and this was true for the bears as well. Like, we're just not reading one another's behavior, in the way that wild, where the non-human species or the human is trying to interact with us, because we have our own sort of stories built up about one another. So I wish I had dropped my guard more often with my brother, and let him in when he was trying, been able to recognize that. And sharing physical space with him was really, really important. So in ways where, technology has brought us closer together, and then also isolated us too. So more FaceTime with him would have been great. And I have a lot of regrets about my relationship with my brother, and where I could have put in more energy. And I guess, it is cliche to say, like, life is so precious, but it is, and we don't get to do things twice. So it's so hard. And then also just accepting, like, the imperfection and the messiness of it all. Like, not every interaction with him was fantastic, but little things, like the way that we share information with one another, it does stick. And I don't know. I'm not sure if that's helpful.
I think it will be helpful to a lot of our listeners.
Yeah.
What do you hope readers take away from Black Bear?
I hope I guess sort of on that vein that I was just chatting about, like, I hope they feel a sense of just the necessity of looking for common ground in these very, very divided times, to try not to otherize one another. I know that's so difficult right now. To always think about the ways, like, that, we're all individuals. We all have our quirks, no matter our politics or what. Like, like, there's this quote, that we can contain multitudes. And I think that's what I tried to take to both the narrative with the bears and the narrative with my brother, the way he was such an individual, and I could lean into all those things that made him so unique, that had nothing to do with his politics. And that made me, find empathy with him and love him and try to understand him on a deeper level. And the same with the bears too. When I dropped the fear story and the fear narrative, I was able to, watch them just being bears on the landscape, and all the beautiful things, and in allowing them to be close. Like, I realized, like, when cubs are nursing, they kind of purr. They have this, like, motor-like purr. And that was so beautiful to hear. All of those things I would have not been capable learning about had I just continued to chase them into the bush and, drive them off. And the same with my brother. Had I not gone to his home and spent time with him, observing him be a parent, and how tender he was, how beautiful he was with his children. Like, I am grateful, so grateful I got the opportunity to do that with him, and sort of, work towards that reconciliation. So I hope people can relate, and I hope it brings a gentleness to people's relationship, whether that's with the wildlife or whether that's with, the people in their lives.
Those are really relatable and beautiful takeaways. Trina Moyles, author of Black Bear, A Story of Siblinghood and Survival. Thank you so much for joining me on the Facing Project.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. This has been such a beautiful conversation.
Black Bear, A Story of Siblinghood and Survival is out now everywhere books are borrowed and sold. Learn more about Trina Moyles and her work at trinamoyles.com. I want to leave you today with closing words from Trina's book that I feel encapsulates not only the moment in time we're living in, that often feels like an us versus them, but also is at the heart of the work we hope Stories from the Facing Project do to move hearts and minds. As we like to say, stories connect us, and through that connection, we break down walls. Trina writes, if we could learn to shed our colonial views of conquering nature, of dominating one another, and practice care for a species as common and dispensable and devalued as the black bear, we might begin to heal and repair our broken relationships with the earth. If we could learn to see one another not as what we think we generally know about the other, but rather as who we are as unique, complex individuals, we might discover space beyond our ideological differences for understanding, empathy, and healing. Thank you again to Trina Moyles for joining me on today's show, and to her publisher Pegasus Books for providing a complimentary copy of Black Bear, a story of siblinghood and survival. To listen to past episodes of this program, visit indianapublicradio.org/The Facing Project, or find us on your favorite podcasting app, or on YouTube, or on the NPR network, or just ask your smart speaker to play The Facing Project on NPR. To continue the conversation about this episode, find us on Facebook and Instagram at Facing Project. The Facing Project is recorded at Indiana Public Radio at Ball State University of beautiful and wonderful and evergreen Muncie, Indiana. And it's produced by the amazing producer and audio engineer extraordinaire, Sean Ashcraft. The show is distributed nationally through PRX. I'm your host, J.R. Jameson. And until next time, I wish you the courage to share your own story and the empathy to listen to others.